Hello everyone, welcome back for part 2 on our lesson, God of Your Fathers. Yesterday we were talking a little bit about Moses and kind of bringing him into the picture as the main point of this lesson, and talking about how he came across the burning bush and how God spoke to him through that bush and told him that he wanted to use Moses to bring his people out of Egypt. And we see the beginnings of Moses kind of running through some of the fears and failures in his mind, and God working through those things. So if we take a look at Moses' history and his upbringing and the things surrounding him, we can see that Moses had a heritage of faith. Hebrews 11:23 says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment." When the command went out from the king that every baby boy should be turned over to Pharaoh's guards and be cast into the cast into the river, Moses' mother, Jochebed, and his father, Amram, refused. As soldiers patrolled the streets, these God-fearing parents undertook the impossible task of keeping a newborn baby quiet. I cannot imagine what care they must have taken with him, making sure he was never wet and never hungry. And beyond that, I don't know how it's possible. Having recently had a newborn myself, sometimes it just seems like they cry for no apparent reason. So to be able to keep this child quiet was an impossible task. God's hand must have been on them. So by faith, they hid Moses for 3 months. They were not afraid of the king. Why? Because faith trumps fear. When they realized it was no longer possible to hide Moses away, Amram and Jochebed exhibited even greater faith. They put Moses in the bulrush ark by faith. By faith, his mother carried him to the crocodile-infested waters of the Nile and left him floating among the reeds. She left her little boy in God's hands. Faith means that when we reach the end of human ability, we launch our hopes out into the deep and trust in God to keep them afloat. In both their determination to hold on and their willingness to let go, Moses' father and mother displayed their faith in Jehovah, and they are mentioned among the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11. If we have a heritage of faith, that is a blessing that we should never take for granted. So we see that Moses had a heritage of faith, but Moses also then had to develop a faith of his own. His mother instilled her faith in Moses even while she nursed him. She and her father taught Moses of the faith of their fathers. They instilled in him that he was a Hebrew, not an Egyptian. Yet Moses eventually had to make the decision to have faith for himself. Hebrews 11:24 through 26 tells us, "By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward." Moses made his parents' faith personal, even after he was taken from their home and moved to the palace, and even when he was trained in all of the knowledge, customs, and pagan lore of the Egyptians. But as he stood at this burning bush, Moses could only look back and see his past failures. Moses had sinned and then tried to cover it up. Moses went out to visit his people and saw an Egyptian taskmaster whipping a Hebrew slave. In his anger, Moses killed the slave driver. Moses' action was no premeditated, organized insurrection or bid for nationwide freedom. It was an impetuous and furious murder. As we so often do when we sin, Moses buried the dead taskmaster in the sand. However, either the body was discovered or someone, perhaps even the Hebrew slave that he had tried to help, spread word of the murder. Moses failed to unite his people or gain their support. Acts 7:25 said, "For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not." Moses failed even at bringing peace between two of his fellow Hebrews that were fighting, and he was rejected and scorned by those that he had tried to help. Without the popular support of his own people, Moses' attempt at becoming a freedom fighter died with the first blow. Subsequently, Moses fled into obscurity in Midian rather than facing the king's wrath. Shame and a feeling of cowardice must have plagued Moses all of those silent years in the wilderness. Moses' sister Miriam, who had once summoned the courage to speak to Pharaoh's daughter on his behalf, but Moses had fled and left Miriam and his brother Aaron behind. He had abandoned his family and people to slavery, resigned himself to exile, and accepted the death of his dreams. Sometimes in our lives we may feel like that we've been through a desert experience of lost faith or failed dreams. You know, there are things in my life, even recently, where I would say, oh, that's a failure. Oh, man, I messed that up. Oh, I shouldn't have done that right. But it's important to remember that God still loves us. He is still proud to be our God, and He wants to empower us to do better in spite of our failures and insecurities. I hope that God touches your heart today and that He will speak to you throughout the remainder of your day. God bless.